8 years ago, she called me a loser. Tonight, she has no idea who just walked through that door. She walked in like nothing had changed. She was about to find out everything had. Still wearing thrift store button-downs, I see. Still renting, I assume? Ledgerline? That deal was insane. 1.4 billion. You're a legend right now. 8 years of doubt. One sentence to undo it all. I had no idea, she whispered. You didn't ask, I said. If you have ever been told you would never amount to anything by the one person who was supposed to love you the most, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens at that reunion will change the way you look at every quiet, broken moment in your own life. And if this story moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe right now, because stories like this one deserve to be shared with people who need to hear them. My name is Daniel Cole, and 8 years ago, I was the kind of man people pitied. I want to start there, in the mud, because you cannot understand the height of a mountain if you never saw the valley beneath it. I grew up in Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone, where the diner on Main Street still used a bell above the door, and where a boy from the wrong side of the tracks was never allowed to forget where he came from. I met Vanessa Hale in 10th grade. She was the kind of girl who made hallways go quiet. Golden hair, easy laugh, the daughter of the town's only orthodontist. I was the kid whose father drove a tow truck and whose mother cleaned houses on weekends to keep the lights on. Nobody expected us to end up together, but somehow, against every sensible prediction in that small town, we did. We got married the summer after we both turned 24. I remember standing at the altar of the little Methodist church on Elm Street, sweating through my rented suit, promising her forever in front of 120 people, who all secretly wondered how long it would last. For a while, it was good. I was working 2 jobs, days at a hardware store, nights doing freelance coding work I taught myself from library books and forum threads because we couldn't, afford a real computer science degree. Vanessa worked the front desk at her father's practice. We rented a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, and some nights the smell of dryer sheets was the only thing sweet about our life. But dreams cost money, and I didn't have any. I started building a piece of software in my spare time. A simple inventory tracking tool for small hardware stores like the one I worked at. I believed in it the way you believe in something when you have nothing else to hold on to. I poured every free hour into it. I stopped going to Vanessa's family dinners because I was coding. I stopped taking her to the movies because I was coding. I told her over and over, just give me 2 more years. I promise this is going somewhere. She used to look at me across our small kitchen table with an expression I mistook for patience, but which I now understand was something closer to exhaustion. The trouble was, belief doesn't pay rent, and it definitely doesn't impress a family that measures a man's worth by the car he drives. Vanessa's mother started asking, not so subtly, when I was going to get serious and find real work. Her father offered me a job managing the supply closet at his practice, a kind gesture wrapped around a quiet insult. I turned it down. Vanessa never forgave me for that. The fights started small. A comment here, a sigh there. Then they grew teeth. She told me once, in the middle of a screaming match over an unpaid electric bill, that she was tired of being married to a boy playing pretend at being an entrepreneur. She said the word loser so casually that it didn't even sound like an insult anymore. It sounded like a fact she had simply gotten used to stating out loud. 8 years ago, on a rainy Tuesday in October, she left. She packed 2 suitcases while I was at the hardware store, and when I came home, the apartment smelled like her perfume and nothing else. She left a note on the kitchen counter, not even a full page, telling me she needed a life, not a dream. She filed for divorce 3 weeks later. I signed the papers in a coffee shop parking lot because I couldn't afford a lawyer to fight for anything, and honestly, there wasn't much left to fight over. She kept the good dishes. I kept a laptop with 4 years of unfinished code and a heart that had been quietly dismantled, piece by piece, for longer than I wanted to admit. I won't pretend the months after were easy. I slept on a friend's couch for a while. I ate a lot of instant noodles. There were nights I sat on the floor of that borrowed apartment, staring at lines of code that refused to compile, wondering if Vanessa had been right about me all along, wondering if I really was just a man chasing a dream that was never going to catch up to him. But something in me refused to lie down. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was spite, if I'm being honest. Maybe it was simply that I had nothing left to lose. And a man with nothing left to lose is one of the most dangerous and determined creatures on earth. I kept building. I kept refining that inventory software. adding features, fixing bugs at 3 in the morning, teaching myself things I had no business understanding without a formal education. I started showing it to small business owners in neighboring towns. A hardware store in Ridgefield agreed to try it for free. Then a family-owned pharmacy. Then a chain of 5 auto parts stores across the county. It took 2 years before the software, which I eventually named Ledgerline, started making real money. It took 4 years before a regional retail group offered to license it across 200 locations. It took 6 years before a venture capital firm in Chicago found me through a cold email I almost didn't send, and offered to invest in scaling Ledgerline into a full logistics and inventory platform for mid-sized retailers across the country. I said yes with hands that were shaking so hard I could barely sign the term sheet. What happened over the next 2 years still feels, some mornings, like it happened to somebody else. Ledgerline grew from a scrappy tool used by 5 stores to a platform serving over 4,000 retail locations nationwide. We built a warehouse optimization arm. We built a predictive restocking algorithm that saved our clients an average of 18% on inventory cost. Then, 18 months ago, a Fortune 500 logistics conglomerate acquired 60% of the company in a deal that valued Ledgerline at just over $1.4 billion. I still remember the exact moment the deal closed. I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room on the 32nd floor of a Chicago office tower, surrounded by lawyers in suits that probably cost more than the used car I drove for most weeks. And when the final signature landed on the final page, nobody in that room cheered the way they do in movies. There was just a quiet exhale, a round of handshakes, and someone from the investment bank quietly sliding a bottle of champagne across the table that nobody had the energy to open right away. I excused myself to the restroom, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the sink for almost 10 minutes, thinking not about the money, but about my mother, who used to iron other people's linens on Saturday mornings so that our own electric bill could be paid on time, and my father, who fell asleep most nights in his recliner still wearing his work boots because he was too tired to bend down and untie them. Neither of them lived to see that room. I have never once, in the years since, been able to fully separate the number on that acquisition contract from the memory of both of them working themselves into early graves for a life that never once let them exhale the way I did on that restroom sink. I became, on paper and in every practical sense, a billionaire. The boy from the wrong side of the tracks in Millbrook, the man Vanessa Hale once called a loser at a kitchen table over an unpaid electric bill, now sat on boards, spoke at logistics conferences, and had a net worth with more zeros than he ever knew how to picture as a kid pumping gas for his father's tow truck friends. But here is the part that matters more than any number. Success did not fill the hole Vanessa left. It didn't erase the nights I doubted myself, and it didn't erase the years I spent believing I might actually be exactly what she said I was. Money is a strange thing. It changes the furniture of your life without necessarily rearranging the furniture of your heart. I still flinched sometimes when I remembered the sound of that apartment door closing behind her. I still, on quiet nights, wondered what it might have looked like if she had believed in me instead of leaving. So when the invitation to our 10-year high school reunion showed up in my email, forwarded through an old classmates group chat, decorated with a photo of our sun-faded Millbrook High mascot, my first instinct was to delete it. I hadn't set foot in that town in 6 years. My parents had passed by then, my mother 2 years after the divorce, my father a year after that, both worn down by decades of work that never seemed to end. There was nothing left in Millbrook for me except memory, and I had spent a long time trying to outrun memory. But something made me open the invitation again. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the quiet, unspoken hope that closure sometimes only arrives when you walk back into the room where you were broken. I RSVP'd yes before I could talk myself out of it. I did not tell anyone who I had become. That part matters. I did not fly in on a private jet, though by then I could have. I did not wear a designer suit or bring an entourage. I drove myself in a plain rented sedan, wearing a simple gray button-down and jeans, the same kind of clothes I might have worn 8 years earlier, when I still smelled like the hardware store at closing time. Some quiet part of me wanted to see what people remembered, and whether they remembered me at all beyond the label that had been stitched onto my back the day my marriage ended in that small, town's collective memory. The guy Vanessa Hale left because he couldn't provide. I spent the drive back into Millbrook rehearsing, without meaning to, all the versions of this moment I used to imagine late at night in the years right after the divorce. The angry version, where I walked in wearing a tailored suit and made sure everyone in that gym understood exactly what they had underestimated. The cold version, where I simply didn't show up at all and let my absence speak for itself. The version where I brought a date more glamorous than anyone in that town had ever seen, just to prove a point I no longer needed to prove. By the time I pulled into the cracked parking lot behind the school, none of those versions felt true to who I had actually become. I decided, somewhere between the town's single traffic light and the faded "Welcome to Millbrook, population 6,214" sign, that I would walk in exactly as myself, without performance, without armor, and let whatever happened simply happen. The reunion was held in the renovated gymnasium of Millbrook High, strung with fairy lights and a banner that read, 10 years later, still Millbrook strong. I stood near the back for the first 20 minutes, nursing a plastic cup of punch, watching old classmates fall into easy laughter with people they hadn't seen in a decade. A few recognized me. Tom Bradley, who used to run the school newspaper, clapped me on the shoulder and asked what I'd been up to. I told him simply, software, small business tools, mostly. He nodded, unimpressed, and drifted back to his group. I let him. There was a strange peace in being underestimated by people who no longer had any power over how I saw myself. And then I saw her. Vanessa walked in wearing a red dress that turned heads the way it probably had every year of her life. Her hair styled the same golden shade I remembered, though time had etched a few new lines at the corners of her eyes. She was with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, expensively dressed, a watch on his wrist that caught the gymnasium lights every time he gestured. I later learned his name was Grant, a regional sales manager for a mattress company 2 towns over, and that Vanessa had been introducing him to people all night as successful, the way she used to describe things she valued most in a partner. She saw me before I could decide whether to approach her or slip toward the exit. Her eyes narrowed for a half-second. Recognition. Then something that looked almost like satisfaction. She crossed the gym floor with Grant trailing behind her, and the noise around us seemed to dim the way it does in memory, though I know now it was simply my own heart pounding louder than the music. "Daniel Cole," she said, her voice carrying just enough for the small cluster of classmates near us to hear. "Wow, look at you. Still wearing thrift store button-downs, I see." A few people laughed, not cruelly, just the reflexive laughter of people who don't want to be caught not laughing. I said nothing yet, just let her continue, because I had learned in business meetings and negotiation rooms that silence is often the most powerful response a person can give. "This is Grant," she said, gesturing to the man beside her. "He runs regional sales for Restwell Mattress Group. Doubled their territory numbers last year. It's so nice," she added, turning back to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "to be with someone who actually followed through on things. Are you still doing that little computer project? The inventory thing?" She said the word "thing" the way you might describe a hobby a child had grown bored of years ago. "Something like that," I said. "Still renting, I assume?" she pressed. And I realized then that she needed this, needed the story of my failure to justify, even 8 years later, the choice she'd made to walk out that rainy October door. Some people cannot feel whole unless the person they left behind stays small enough to prove. They were right to leave. I could have ended it right there. I could have pulled up my phone, shown her the news articles about the acquisition, mentioned the board meetings, the 18 months of headlines calling Ledgerline one of the most significant logistics acquisitions of the decade. But something in me wanted to see how far the moment would go, wanted to understand, one last time, exactly who she had become, and exactly who I had become in the years since we stopped being each other's mirror. "I get by," I said simply. She smiled, satisfied, and turned to the small crowd that had gathered. "You know, Daniel used to tell me he was going to change the world with some app he was coding in our kitchen at 2 in the morning, she said, laughing lightly, inviting the others to laugh with her. "I used to tell him, sweetheart, the world doesn't wait for dreamers. It waits for people who actually do something." A few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the group. Grant smirked and adjusted his watch, the gesture deliberate, performative, aimed at me. It was at that exact moment that Marcus Webb approached, a Millbrook classmate who now worked as a financial analyst in Chicago, someone I hadn't spoken to since graduation, but who, it turned out, had followed the Ledgerline acquisition closely because his firm had clients invested in the deal. "Daniel Cole," Marcus said, eyes wide, extending a hand before I could stop him. "Man, I did not expect to see you here. I mean, Ledgerline? That deal was insane. 1.4 billion? My firm's been talking about that acquisition for months. You're kind of a legend in fintech circles right now." The gymnasium seemed to hold its breath. Vanessa's smile faltered, just slightly, the way ice cracks before it fully gives way. Grant's smirk dissolved into confusion. "Wait," he said slowly. "The Ledgerline guy? That Daniel Cole?" "The one and only," Marcus said, still shaking my hand, oblivious to the seismic shift happening in the small circle around us. "You built that whole platform from scratch, right? Started with some little inventory tool for hardware stores? That's an incredible story. Seriously, man, congratulations." I watched Vanessa's face move through several expressions in the span of about 4 seconds. Disbelief, calculation, something that might have been regret, and finally something she tried very hard to arrange into casual indifference, though her hands, I noticed, had begun to tremble slightly around the stem of her wine glass. "I had no idea," she said quietly, and for the first time in 8 years, her voice didn't carry that practiced edge of superiority. It sounded almost small. "You didn't ask," I said, and I meant it gently, not as a blade, though I understood it landed like one anyway. "You asked if I was still renting." The silence that followed was heavier than any silence I had experienced in years of boardrooms and investor meetings. Grant excused himself to get another drink, though everyone in that circle understood it was simply an exit disguised as thirst. A few classmates who had laughed at Vanessa's jokes moments earlier now looked at her with an entirely different expression. Not cruelty, just the quiet recalibration people do when the story they thought they understood suddenly rewrites itself in front of them. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the moment of vindication itself. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel the surge of vengeful satisfaction that 8 years of quiet hurt might have led you to expect. What I felt, standing in that gymnasium under fairy lights strung by parent volunteers, was something quieter and sadder. A recognition that Vanessa had spent 8 years building her entire identity around a story that was never really about me at all. It was about her own fear of being seen as someone who had chosen wrong, who had bet on the wrong horse and lost. My success didn't threaten her. It simply exposed how much of her confidence had been borrowed from other people's made judgments instead of her own convictions. "Daniel," she said, stepping slightly away from the group, lowering her voice. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" I agreed, mostly out of the same instinct that had made me open that reunion invitation in the mast. The belief that some conversations need to be finished, not to reopen old wounds, but to close them properly. We stepped out onto the side steps of the gymnasium, where the October air was cool and smelled faintly of dry leaves, not unlike the October air on the day she'd left 8 years earlier. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. "I didn't know," she finally said again, as if repeating it might make it easier to metabolize. "I saw the headlines about Ledgerline, but I never connected it to you. I thought you were still—" She stopped herself. "Still what I was when you left," I finished for her. "It's okay, you can say it." She looked down at the concrete steps, arms wrapped around herself against the chill. "I was young and scared," she said. "My parents put so much pressure on me about what a husband should look like on paper. I thought stability meant a title and a paycheck I could see immediately, not a dream I had to trust blind. I convinced myself I was being practical. But honestly, Daniel, I think I was just afraid of being poor the way my mother always warned me I'd end up if I settled." Her words, not mine. I nodded, not because I excused it, but because I understood it. Fear does strange, cruel things to people, and Millbrook had raised both of us on a diet of scarcity dressed up as practicality. "I'm not angry anymore," I told her, and as I said it, I realized it was true. Somewhere between those 3 a.m. coding sessions and the day I signed the acquisition papers, the anger had quietly transformed into something closer to gratitude. Her leaving had, in its own brutal way, given me the freedom to build something entirely my own, without anyone in the next room reminding me daily that I was chasing a fantasy. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Do you regret it? Us, I mean. Everything that happened?" I thought about it honestly before answering, because she deserved an honest answer, and so did I. "I regret how it ended," I said. I don't regret who I became because of it. Those are two different things. She nodded slowly, and I saw something in her eyes that might have been the beginning of understanding, or might simply have been the particular grief of realizing a door has permanently closed. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that anymore, but I am. Thank you, I said, and I meant it, even though gratitude and forgiveness are not always the same thing, and I was still working out which one I actually felt. We didn't fall into each other's arms. This isn't that kind of story, and life, thankfully, rarely writes itself into such convenient endings. We didn't become friends who grabbed coffee every week or exchanged holiday cards, but something settled between us on those concrete steps that night. Not romance, not reconciliation, just a quiet, mutual releasing of a story that had calcified into resentment for far too long. I left Millbrook the next morning before sunrise, the way I often did when visiting places that held more grief than comfort. But this time, driving past the old hardware store, past the laundromat where our first apartment still sat above the dryers humming their endless cycle, I didn't feel the familiar ache I used to carry out of that town. I felt something closer to peace. In the 2 years since that reunion, Ledgerline has continued to grow. We've expanded into international markets, built partnerships with logistics firms across 3 continents, and I've had the strange, humbling privilege of mentoring young entrepreneurs who remind me achingly of the version of myself that used to code at kitchen tables at 2 in the morning, believing in something no one else could see yet. I started a scholarship fund in Millbrook for kids from working-class families who want to study computer science but can't afford the tuition, not out of some need for validation from a town that once measured my worth by my father's tow truck, but because I remember, more vividly than any acquisition headline, what it felt like to need someone to believe in you before you had any evidence to offer in return. Last spring, I drove back to Millbrook one more time, not for a reunion, but to visit the small, computer science classroom at the high school, where the first scholarship recipients had just been announced. I sat in the back row of folding chairs, unrecognized by most of the students, and listened to a 16-year-old girl named Priya explain, with the same nervous, stubborn excitement I remembered feeling at her age, how she wanted to build an app that helped her grandmother's one neighborhood pharmacy manage prescriptions more efficiently. I didn't say much afterward, just shook her hand and told her to keep going even when it feels like no one else believes it will work. She probably has no idea, and may never know, exactly how much that sentence cost me to earn the right to say out loud. I heard, through mutual friends, that Vanessa and Grant separated about a year after the reunion. I don't know the details, and honestly, it isn't mine to know. I wish her well, genuinely, in whatever life she is building now, because carrying resentment towards someone who has already taught you everything they were going to teach you is simply a heavier bag than most of us need to keep dragging behind us. If there is a message in this story, it isn't about revenge, and it isn't really about billions of dollars either, though I understand why that number is the one that grabs headlines and makes for a satisfying reunion scene. The real message is this: the people who doubt you in your darkest, most uncertain years are rarely doubting your potential. More often, they are revealing the limits of their own belief, their own fear, their own inherited scarcity. Their doubt is a mirror pointed at themselves, not a verdict pointed at you. I was called a loser at a kitchen table over an unpaid electric bill. I believed it some nights more than I want to admit. But belief, it turns out, is not a fixed inheritance. It is something you can rebuild, one line of code, one small business client, one sleepless night at a time, until one day you are standing in a gymnasium under fairy lights, and the silence that follows your name is not the silence of judgment anymore, but the silence of people quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew about who you were always going to become. Wherever you are in your own story right now, whether you are in the valley, coding at your own kitchen table at 2 in the morning, or standing in a version of that gymnasium, waiting for someone to finally see you, I hope you remember this. The mountain does not care who doubted you at the bottom of it. It only cares whether you kept climbing. Keep climbing. Your reunion is coming, in one form or another, and when it does, I hope you meet it with the same quiet grace I found on those concrete steps. Not vengeance, but peace, and the unshakable knowledge that you built every inch of your own becoming. If this story reached something in you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told. And somewhere out there, Someone else needs to hear that their own mountain is still worth climbing.